Okay, the Great Transformation, the period from 1828 to 1840. Now, guys, this was a revolutionary time where America is going through a lot of changes. And the first change that we'll talk about is the transportation revolution. Now, of course, when we're talking about this, we'll talk about the area that got the most support from the federal government in extending the nation's roads. Now remember, both government and private enterprise embarked on road building projects following the War of 1812. Why were they doing this? Basically, to help establish a national market economy, political leaders had to find a way to overcome and somehow connect the vast distances and difficult terrain that made up America. Basically, the nation needed a transportation system that could take the resources of the West and South into the North, and then take the northern manufactured goods to the South and West. And then the National Road, by 1838, it had reached Ohio. And within a few more years, it would reach Illinois. And as they're building this road, I mean, they're using state-of-the-art paving. And stone bridges. And at the same time, a series of roads were beginning to emerge into a national transportation network that people are building to connect to the national road. Now, the roads were great for travelers, however, they did very little to bring down the cost of shipping. I mean, it was still 15 cents a mile. A less expensive way was needed. And what is the less expensive way, even though it's a little bit more costly up front, is a network of canals. The new roads linked rural America to an expanding network of waterways that made hauling freight over long distances inexpensive. For example, by 1826, the Erie Canal had been completed. Here you see basically it connects Portsmouth right over here to Albany on the Hudson River. And the cost of shipping goods from Buffalo to Albany fell from $100 to $15. The time it took those goods to get from point A to B fell from 20 days to only 8. Indeed, New York Governor Clinton announced that the canal had already generated $750,000 in profits its very first year it was open. And this flood of goods flowing down the Hudson River allowed New York City to eclipse Boston as a larger city. Now, as you can guess, this is something that others quickly wanted to jump on the bandwagon. For example, down in Pennsylvania, they were jealous of New York's success, So they began a massive canal, road, and waterway system that would make them the commercial center of the Western Hemisphere. They advertised themselves as a golden link to the West. Now, central to this plan was the mainline canal that would connect the Delaware River down over here to the Ohio River in Pittsburgh over here. Now, the only problem was that there was a difference in 2,000 feet in elevation from point A to point B. It somehow had to be overcome. Indeed, they would have needed locks 5 times as great as those on the Erie Canal. And this basically was unable to attain with the knowledge and technology that we had back then. So what did they do? They built the Allegheny Portage Railroad. Basically, it placed barges on top of submerged railroad cars, and these railroad cars would then be taken uphill, as you can see right here, by mules and transported to the next canal that they'd be floated across and then lifted up again. Indeed, it took you 4 such rides if you were going west, and if you were going back east, it would take you 5 rides. Indeed, Charles Dickens took a ride on it and called it an exhilarating ride. And so excited by the success of this project that the designers believed that it will be possible with only 75 miles of canal to connect all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And this Portage Railroad was just a small part of Pennsylvania's investments. I mean, they built tunnels, aqueducts, and enormous locks, all at great cost. Now, a family that traveled on it could make great time. However, the cost on tolls was as much as 6 acres of prime farmland. So a lot of people didn't want to take it. And even though it did carry people out west, the investors really never made a cent on their investment. And this might be true of other investors, because as one can see, canal construction blossomed through the 1830s. You'd have states and individuals that invested more than $100 million on 3,500 miles of canals. States would grant monopolies to canal building companies. Why would they grant monopolies? Well, guys, it was so expensive to build that the only way investors would agree to do it is if there were no competing companies. So it began to be a race between states over who had the best water access. And as you can see from these black lines over here that represent canals, nearly every state in the north and west undertook these canals. between 1820 and 1840. Like the Ohio Canal, which is right over here, was basically built to connect Cleveland on Lake Erie up here to Portsmouth on the Ohio River. And it's completed in 1833, which made it possible for a merchant over here in New York City to go up the Hudson River to Albany, then take the Erie Canal. Here he is. Take this up to Albany, take the Erie Canal over to Lake Ontario, go down to Lake Erie, go down the Ohio Canal, you hit Portsmouth, and you can got it all the way to New Orleans. So guys, we can go all around the U.S. at that time. But these canals aren't cheap. They would cost as much as $20,000 to $30,000 a mile to build. Now, if you were a careful investor, you could make from 15 to 20% interest on the money. But by the 1840s, many of the canal companies were facing bankruptcy. Indeed, Pennsylvania, because of their whole canal system, they got into a debt of $34 million by 1842 and had to suspend state payments for 3 years and pass harsh taxes. And almost every state that got caught up in the canal boom was caught in the same trap. Now, the next thing that really improved our nautical transportation was steam power. Steam power made upstream travel economical. In 1807, Robert Fulton demonstrated that ships could be powered by steam. And Henry M. Shreve pioneered in developing a steamship for the shallower waters of the rivers of the West. Here's a classical kind of like steamboat that had the paddle wheels on the side. And as more and more steam vessels are built, combined with advances in technology, the price of utilizing it, as well as the time, goes down. For example, by 1840, the price for shipping a ton of goods downstream the Mississippi River fell from 1 1/4 cent to less than 1/2 cent. And now that you could finally go upstream, the price fell from 10 cents a mile to less than 1/2 cent. Because the engine's using, it's all done by the engine. Now, as you can guess, this dependable, cheap transportation pushed cotton cultivation as well as agricultural cultivation further into the interior. And Western farmers began to flood the land. Now, as you can guess, if you're an inland town that doesn't have access to rivers and such, you're getting a little jealous. So you had the development of the steam-powered railroad in the late 1820s. Originally developed by Robert Stephenson over in England. And investors in Baltimore hoped that a railroad would allow Baltimore, which was the second largest U.S. city at the time, to successfully compete with New York for Western trade. So in 1828, they formed the Baltimore and Ohio, the B&O. And laid down 13 miles of track. And they got Peter Cooper to build a railroad. Here he is right here on the Tom Thumb, which was the first locomotive ever used in America. And he got it started and powered up, and he started racing along the tracks at a whopping 12 miles an hour. So fast that he boasted that he could beat a horse carrying the same amount of weight as the Tom Thumb. So there was a race held in August of 1830. And who do you think won? Well, the horse, of course. And because steam power was so expensive, the B&O pretty much abandons it. But South Carolina comes in and they ask the federal government for the money to build a 136-mile-long railroad line from Charleston to Hamburg. Now, why did they ask the federal government? Why did they say it was a mail line? Well, because if it was used for the mail, then the federal government would pay for it, because that's a federal office. Well, they did use it to carry mail. Then they started notice, because if you're on a train, you have to stop at stations to take on water that you're losing in the steam power, as well as sand, so you can have traction for your wheels if you have to go like uphill or brake. And anyway, as they'd stop at these stations, and people had no idea how to build like passenger cars or how to arrange things. Here you see they're using wagons. People started saying, hey, can you take me to the next stop? And they started charging them for it. And soon they were making more money out of carrying people than for the mail. But back then, especially if you're using steam power, basically you'd have all your water in a boiler, and the steam pressure of that boiling water would cause that metal to expand. And when you release that pressure and use it to drive like the pistons and everything like that, that pressure is let go, so the stress on the metal isn't as great. But metal really doesn't like to move, so if you don't change out your boilers, or if you have a really weak-made boiler, it's going to explode. And the boilers exploded, which injured and killed some of the passengers and damaged some of the mail. So what the South Carolina did is basically it got one of these cargo things. They filled it up with bales of cotton, and they put the passengers behind that, and then the mail would be in the very last car. And this cargo car with cotton on it basically would become a buffer car that could absorb most of the explosion. Maybe a passenger might get injured, but the mail would still be safe. And by the way, Massachusetts also did that to its railway system. Regardless, however, the railroad doesn't really overtake canal-based transportation in importance until the 1850s. I mean, railroad usage remains small. By 1850, we only have 9,000 miles of track laid. Now, what's preventing rails from becoming more competitive? Well, there were no real rail standards set. Because if you were a company, you'd have your rails at a different width apart than a competitor, meaning that you couldn't connect your railroads. And you had basically investors looking out for themselves. It kind of retarded that growth. Well, now that America is moving faster, it should come as no surprise that the next revolution we get into is the information revolution. Basically, the revolution in transportation produced a revolution in the transmission of information. I mean, people had feared that America was too big to make it work. I mean, in the 1790s, it took a week to travel from Virginia to New York City, and almost 3 weeks for a letter from Cincinnati to get to the Atlantic coast. I mean, it used to take so long to get places that people like Thomas Jefferson visioned our nation growing with a number of small republics within the whole. But the opening of the Erie Canal changes everything. You had letters from Buffalo reaching New York City in 6 days and might get all the way out to New Orleans in as little as 2 weeks. So newspapers and magazines dramatically increased in number. I mean, in the 1790s, we had 92 newspapers with a circulation of 4 million. By 1835, we have 1,258 newspapers with a circulation of more than 90 million. And then we take a huge leap forward with Samuel F.B. Morse, who perfected the electric telegraph in 1936. Basically, Morse was a painter, a sculptor, the president of New York School of Design. He began experimenting with chemistry and electricity, producing the electric telegraph, which he patented in 1836. But, you know, he pressed down the button on one deal, and on the other side, the receiver, it tapped down, but he had no idea to do with it until he came up with the Morse code for the letters. And by 1843, Congress agreed to pay for a line that ran from Baltimore to Washington. And on May 24th, 1844, the first message ever telegraphed out, "What hath God wrought?" was sent over the wires. Now, the funny thing is that most people don't know is one of the things that was pushing Morse in the development of the telegraph was this fear that the Catholic Church was going to try to strip away the West from America. And he believed that his invention would thwart that conspiracy. Okay, ready? Now we're going to talk about the rising up of our industry with the manufacturing boom. The American system of manufacturing. Now, before we made this shift, 60% of Americans' clothing was spun from raw fibers in women's homes. Some households even made their own furniture, clocks, and tools. Although skilled craftsmen would do much of this. These craftsmen usually worked from their own homes and would take their journeymen and apprentices from the same family. But by the 1820s, more and more is moved to a factory system. Now, the first guy that we're going to talk about in textiles, because that's almost always where industrialization begins, is Samuel Slater. Basically, he developed the putting out system, where factory-produced thread was delivered to homes and families that carried out the weaving of turning that thread into fabric on looms that they owned. This system gave cash to the families and allowed some members, like the elderly or children, to contribute, and allowed for work and lulls in the farming calendar. The only problem with this is that Samuel Slater basically had no quality control, and he also had no production control, because maybe a crisis at the home had prevented them from being able to weave for the last week. Well, then comes Henry Cabot Lowell. You remember we talked about him at the end of the last lecture. Basically, he and his partners began to put the spinning and weaving machines in one place. What are the results of this, besides the fact that factory-made clothing goes through a huge change? Well, by putting the spinning and weaving machines in one place, basically it cut down on the time and cost of manufacturing. Quality control became easier. But the tools of the trade are owned by the manufacturer, not the people. So the employees are under constant supervision. But this type of employment and work is so efficient that the putting out system of labor falls by as much as 90%. You have homespun cloth falling off in use because basically the machine-made clothing is so much cheaper and readily available. So from 1830s to the 1840s, ready-made clothing becomes the norm. kind of like making your own bread at home. You can do it. It tastes great, but it's so much cheaper to just go to the store and buy the bread. Then you don't have to clean up the mess. Then your kid will have even slices. Now, the next thing that's very important to manufacturing is interchangeable parts. Traditional manufacturing made each item one at a time. Casting or carving by hand each gear, lever, and wheel. If an item broke, then it could only be repaired by custom making a piece to fix it. This made the manufacturing process slow and difficult, and employment in the trade was limited to highly skilled craftsmen. But Thomas Jefferson noted, while ambassador to France, the whole concept of standardizing parts, so that a wheel from one clock would work in another. And you had mass production of like screws and similarly made parts. And Eli Whitney was the first American to attempt a large-scale usage. He got together with his partner, John H. Hall, and they were going to make parts for a gun, because back then you either made the lock or the firing mechanism, the stock, which is the piece of wood that the barrel and everything would ride on, or the barrel. Lock, stock, and barrel. And John Hall basically demonstrated the concept's feasibility in gun manufacturing at Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1824. And it was so successful that these the whole idea of interchangeable parts quickly spread to like the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, out to private gun manufacturers like Simeon North and Samuel Colt. And within 20 years, a whole array of products like padlocks, sewing machines, clocks, farm tools, are all being made with interchangeable parts. Okay, now this is the story of Chauncey Jerome, basically a guy who lived during this time. And when he was the son of a very poor blacksmith, he only had 3 years of school before his dad died. And he kind of had to go to work as a farm laborer to support his family. But by 1814, he works for a Connecticut clockmaker, Eli Terry. He found that he had a lot of skill in building wooden cases for the clocks. Basically like a grandfather clock, the big, tall cases. And by 1817, he goes into business for himself. He basically rents out a water wheel at night and utilizes the power of that water wheel to drive a saw. So he buys the wood in bulk, and he mass produces all these identical cases. He makes a lot of money. By 1824, he goes into a partnership with his brother, making brass 8-day clocks. Now, why is it called an 8-day clock? Well, basically, every 8 days you'd have to rewind it. And they sold for $20 a piece, which was a price that was affordable to the middle-class man. And he does really good until all of a sudden we have the financial panic of 1837, where he loses more than $100,000. Well, guys, if life knocks you down, then you got to stand back up. And so what he does is he goes and he starts making brass one-day clocks, meaning every day you'd have to wind it up. It didn't cost as much as the $20 clock, proved to be incredibly popular. Because of this, you have a lot of people making counterfeit clocks. And within just 1 year, where am I? Okay, found my place. Within just 1 year, he's paid off all his debts, and he still clears $35,000. And, he's doing extraordinarily well. Well, it's not until 1850 that he finally takes a vacation. And he tells his brother, hey, whatever you do, don't mess with the business. Don't do anything. And as soon as he leaves, who should come in but P.T. Barnum, the great showman who said a sucker's born every minute. And he says, hey, I got this great clock company I'm going to sell you guys at like almost no cost. And his partners got all excited. They buy the company, but basically it was a company that was ridden with debt. So much debt that it couldn't be paid back. And by 1855, Chauncey Jerome had lost everything. And in a book he published in 1860, he complained bitterly about the dehumanizing effects of the new economy and the new workplace. Well, what was this workplace like? New workplaces and new workers. Early factory builders created company towns to house their workers. Factory production allowed employers to hire unskilled laborers and immigrants. And in these company towns, basically the residents had to depend on the company for like stores, schools, and housing. But basically at the factories, all members of the family could be employed. Factory men would recruit families to come from the economically depressed countryside, live in a neat row house with a small vegetable garden. Women could work on the production line. Men would operate heavy machinery, and they'd be the mechanics or the millwrights. Even children, they might do light work in the factory, tend the vegetable gardens. Now that was most factory towns. However, there was a very different system at Waltham and Lowell. Basically, they were hard-pressed to find families because the economy had been so bad in their area that most of the young men had left. So basically, they had to recruit unmarried farm girls. Because that's all they had. And guys, this is back when nice girls didn't work in factories. So to get their families to allow their daughters to work there, they lived in dormitories, highly supervised dormitories. They paid the girls cash wages. Why would they pay the girls cash wages? Well, it was understood that a lot of that money would be going back home to mom and dad. They'd have cultural events like poetry readings or piano recitals. And they'd even offer education to the girls. Give them an education. Make them better than they were when they came in. Now, this is totally different from a packed city like New York. They had a totally different labor pool. You had immigrants flooding in. And in the factory system, like a shoe factory, one neighbor might make the soles, another might make the heels, and so forth. Basically, machine production made it possible so that now the manager was no longer a master craftsman who took a paternalistic role and who felt some responsibility for his workers. At the end of the day, it was all about money. Factory owners were obligated to their investors to make the most possible profit they could. And if you think that's a bad thing, guys, that's the stock market. You buy stock in the hopes that it offers a good return. So how did this affect the society there? Well, wages were kept low. You had larger numbers of people living in total and abject poverty. Ready to go to the next slide? And remember, the immigrants between 1820 and 1860 differed from earlier newcomers. I mean, from 1820 to 1830, we had 151,000 immigrants come to our nation. From 1830 to 1840, we had 600,000. And from 1840 to 1850, more than 1.5 million people come to our country. Most of these guys are desperately poor and unskilled, collecting in the port and manufacturing areas and cities of the north. They can't afford to get out. Most were Catholics who had come from either Ireland or Germany. Potato famine brought the Irish. Political unrest brought the Germans. Even though some of the Germans were highly educated and might have been the sons of merchants. And here in Texas during this time, a lot of Germans also came to Texas when it was part of Mexico, its early republic, and our early statehood. They would settle in ethnically distinct neighborhoods, creating their own institutions, like churches, beer halls, stores. In Texas, we have like the Sons of Herman halls or shooting clubs that the Germans started. And as many people lack the money to buy a farm and escape, except here in Texas, they were a perfect captive labor force. Ready to go to the next slide? So what were living conditions like in blue-collar America? Well, wages were exceedingly low. And most women complained about the continual and repetitive work, which might lead them to daydreaming. And daydreaming around fast-moving machinery is not a good idea. Like a piece of your hair or a finger might get caught, leading to dismemberment. Wages were kept low because there's always a replacement that was willing to work for less. Urban working class neighborhoods were overcrowded. The housing conditions were wretched. Basically, owners tried to cram the most people into the least possible amount of space. And although terrible, you had guys like Samuel Gompers, who had become a future labor leader of the AFL. He commented that his apartment, which was next to a slaughterhouse, so he had all the smells and sounds of living next to that. Even though he lived next to that, he said his housing was much better than what he had had back in London. Social life for a gentile class. So we talked about the poor. Well, what was it like for the rich? Well, guys, there is a total end of traditional owner and worker relationships. I mean, where it used to be that journeymen and their apprentices lived in the same household, shared the same food, suffered the same hardships, the owners no longer reside with their workers. Indeed, they began to associate with each other only and to form their own social and civic voluntary organizations. Now, at times, these associations might be a church organization, and rather than eating, drinking, and playing with their employees, they formed societies with other business owners. They didn't go to public theater. Now they went to like opera companies that were supported. They lived in houses way far out. So there's a lot of distancing going on. Well, what about the wife? Well, the traditional role of the employer's wife also changed. They started to have this cult of domesticity that replaced their former business responsibilities. Living in their new homes, set apart from the workers and industry, they were supposed to be remove themselves from the crass world of commerce and protect her man from the world of the domestic. They were basically seen as purifiers, that they take all the bad and exude only good. Now they formed needlework, reading, and art appreciation societies. But their main activity was child rearing. Indeed, during this time, there was a famous teacher and author by the name of Bronson Alcott that spoke of how children needed to be lovingly cared for. And we no longer believed in infant depravity, where infants were born sinful creatures and had to learn discipline. But instead they were born kind of as a blank slate, to be loved and cherished. And in raising children, mothers were very important because they were preparers for the future of the Republic. And even though home and children became her focus, she could also join voluntary organizations for social reform. Also because eventually kids grow up. So women took these notions of raising children out of a nursery and took it towards reforming the world. There were large groups that supported such items as anti-alcoholism, Sunday schools, etc., where they tried to use their nurturing and purifying talents to improve a chaotic and immoral society. Okay, so we've talked about the haves, we've talked about the have-nots. Now we're going to talk about trying to keep what you got. The middle class. Now, members of life and culture among the new middle class. Members of this new class of like managers, clerks, and teachers. Later on, it was okay for a woman to become a teacher, even though the majority at this time were men. They were relatively young. And most of these white-collar workers tried to live the same kind of lives their bosses did. Married later, have fewer kids, live in their own little communities, little housing associations, even though they weren't called house associations back then. And just like their bosses did, they congregated in voluntary associations, like social, trade, and professional, in groups like the Odd Fellows and the Masons. They helped reinforce traditional values. And in these groups, people could discuss the latest books and such. They also formed missionary societies. So that's what's going on in the North and West. Well, what about in the South? The new Cotton Empire in the South. A new birth for the slavery system. Now, slavery had been dying out. Indeed, in 1782, Virginia made it legal to free the slaves, and many masters had done so. In 1784, Thomas Jefferson proposed making it illegal for slavery to spread to any of the nation's territories after 1800. And even though it didn't pass, it was close. Some Southern leaders contemplated abolishing slavery and transporting the newly freed men back to Africa. However, one thing prevented that: cotton. The industrial world needed the cotton. And remember, the South was supplying not only America's needs, but also England bought 80% of the cotton that it consumed from the South. Slavery revived as a result of this shift to cotton. A plantation owner could achieve impressive annual profits of between 8 to 10%. And this whole demand for slave labor led to a large interstate trade in slaves. I mean, outside the Cotton Belt, money was made in breeding and selling slaves. Like a healthy male in his mid-20s might sell for $1,800. If they were a skilled craftsman, you might get $2,500 for them. And younger or older men, or those in less than perfect health, would be sold for less. But even a male too young to work in the fields would still fetch between $250 to $500. Women skilled at, say, weaving might actually sell for more than a male craftsman. A particularly ravishing beauty might sell for as much as $5,000 at auction. And usually they would become the master's mistress. And slaves were a major capital investment, because the cotton economy not only demanded slaves, but large gangs of workers. Ready for the next slide? Now, in addition to cotton field labor, slave occupations included service in homes and non-field work. Between 1797 and 1865, only 81% of the male and 69% of the female slaves were field hands. 2% of slave men and 17% of slave women were house slaves. And the remaining 14% of slave women sewed, weaved, processed food, and 17% of slave men did stuff like drove wagons, piloted riverboats, herded cattle. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, you did have some slave craftsmen that were skilled artisans, like carpenters. A cooper is a guy who makes a barrel, etc., that might form guilds. But usually if they did that, there were large legal restrictions imposed on them at the demand of white artisans that didn't like the competition. Examples of where this happened would be like Charleston, Norfolk, Richmond, Savannah. Well, what was living conditions like for the Southern slaves? Well, while keeping the costs as low as possible, the owners provided generally adequate living conditions. The housing wasn't crowded, but it was very, very simple. I mean, you might have a one-room log cabin with dirt floors and a fireplace or stove, 16 feet by 18 feet. They tried not to crowd more than one family into a home, and they usually had about 5 to 6 inhabitants. Now, one of the reasons they tried not to crowd more than a lot of people into one place is because, guys, as you might know, remember growing up, if one person gets sick in the house, everybody gets sick in the house. And they didn't want their workforce affected that way. The clothing was pretty basic. They had 2 suits of cotton for the spring, 2 suits of wool for the winter. The food, it was adequate as well. And indeed, slaves actually received more meat than did northerners. But not only meat, but also like milk, corn, potatoes, peas, beans, molasses, and fish. A rich diet compared to the northern workers. Indeed, rather than complaining that they didn't have enough food, most of the slave accounts complained that they always had to eat the same thing. And diseases related to dietary deficiencies and the working and living conditions abounded. But they affected whites to the same degree when conditions were similar. And even though, yes, there was violent treatment by some to the slaves, it wasn't typical. Why? Because slaves were money. And they're what achieved, like the planters and everything like that, to make even more money. But I will tell you that slaves were the first to suffer when the owners weren't doing well economically. So then, what was life like for the common life among common Southern whites? The majority of Southern whites were yeoman farmers. Just poor guys working on the farm. I mean, in some of the larger Southern cities, you might have families that own stores, craft shops, might be an attorney, a doctor, or another professional. But most of them were simply poor farmers. And only a minority of Southerners owned slaves. Between 2/3 and 3/4 owned no slaves whatsoever. Indeed, the ones that did own slaves, the third or quarter, how you want to look at it, the majority of them owned only 1 or 2. Less than 1% of the slave-owning population had 20 or more slaves, which is what you needed to be a planter. So, of course, because most of these whites don't own any slaves, they were kind of labeled as shiftless, lazy, idle, backcountry rabble by the planters. Ready for the next slide? But on the flip side, the planters depended on these guys because they were the ones that sold the grains, meat products, and other commodities to the plantations or to merchants. And the relations with the planters was always strained. Why? Because they were fearful of the planters' expansion. and taken over their farms, buying it out from under them. And basically they would take their frustrations to the ballot box to try and vote in new political leaders. So the planters had to try to keep them happy. Ready for the next slide? Free blacks in the South. Now, the South's small population of free African Americans descended mostly from blacks emancipated during the late 1700s. Most worked for white employers, even though a handful worked as artisan and skilled craftsmen. I mean, in the Upper South, you had some black men who were hired as apprentices or were master craftsmen. They'd be like coopers, the barrel makers, painters, brick masons, blacksmiths, boatsmen, bakers, barbers. For women, they might be a seamstress, a washer, a cook. They might run a grocery or a tavern, a restaurant. They could get a lot of respect by being a folk healer. They could be a midwife or a prostitute. Now, as much as 10% of the free black households were slave owners. Now, that might sound weird, but remember, if one bought themselves out of slavery and they wanted to have like their wife or kids, they would have to work to raise up the money to buy their wife or kids. And black man could not free his slave, his wife or his child. Legally, they couldn't do that. Now, there were cases of free blacks that did become planters and became very wealthy. Just like the Native American tribes, there were plantations owned by Native Americans, the Creeks, the Cherokee. And restriction on free blacks increased during the early 19th century. And so now, we'll talk about a new planet aristocracy. Okay, the traditional imagery of an aristocracy of great planters is largely mythical. Remember, only a third to a quarter of Southerners actually own slaves. Most of these slaveholders lived on small farms with fewer than 5. Indeed, it was rare if you had 5 slaves. Less than 1% of the slave-owning population owned large plantations with many slaves. To be a planter, you had to have 20 or more slaves. Ready for the next slide? Most of these owners were self-made and unrefined men. Their wives played a large part in running the plantation. Again, that's kind of in support of the cult of domesticity. as the slaves were seen as little less than children by some, not all. But only a very small number of the South could live lives in the manner of a grand aristocracy. Okay, so that's this lecture. And our next lecture is going to kind of take a look at how we reacted as a society to this transformation that's going on.